Thank you, Peter. Cheers. This is a picture of my dad. I took this picture on the occasion of his 80th birthday. We had a great party, loads of family there. I'm Irish, so we have big families, big event. And I put this up to credit him with being a large part of who I am today, because one of my big passions is sustainability, and it's in large part because of him. When I was a kid growing up in Cork in Ireland, I live in Seville now in Spain, but when I was a kid growing up in Cork in Ireland, he used to take me to the countryside every weekend and inculcate in me a love of nature. And I went on to do a degree in biology. I did postgrad. I was studying for a PhD in biological control, which I never finished because I'm a bit ADD and I like things that are kind of shiny and new. And at the time, in the 90s, technology was all the kind of rage and it was all the new and shiny. So I started a software company, and then things moved on and I joined SAP, and I now work for SAP. But I'm now working at the intersection of my two passions, technology and sustainability. So it's a phenomenal place to be. Unfortunately, my dad is no longer with us. It's not that he's died, but he was diagnosed in 2010 with Alzheimer's. So now, fully 12 years later, there's not much left of him. But I'm very much a glass half full person. And so I want to think that he's in a happy place because he's no idea what's gone on in the world in the last 2.5 years with COVID and the war in Ukraine and things like that. And things have changed in the world. And because of things like the COVID and the war in Ukraine, there's been a lot happening in the climate space which might have gone below the radar. So I want to talk a little bit about that and the things that have happened there that you might have missed and the implications that those have. So in June of last year, the European Commission passed legislation which requires all 27 nations of the EU to reduce their emissions 55% against the 1990 baseline by 2030. And now, in the abstract, that's kind of meaningless. Those are just numbers. We've already reduced against that baseline 24%, so that leaves 31% to go between now and 2030. That's 7.5 years we have to reduce our emissions 31%. Now, during 2020, when we had the big lockdown, we managed to reduce our emissions 7%. But of course, in 2021, as things started opening up again, the emissions went back up 5%. So between 2020 and 2021, we had a net reduction of 2% in 2 years. And now we've got to get 31% out of the system in the next 7.5 years. And this is a legally binding mandate on all 27 nations. It's not an aspirational goal. This is something that has to happen. The amount of systemic structural change that this will require is something most people haven't even contemplated. And it's going to happen in the next 7.5 years. And not only that, Europe is also putting in place a carbon border, a carbon tax, essentially, which means that countries outside the EU, which have a high amount of carbon, when they ship goods to Europe, if they have a high carbon footprint, they'll be taxed on the way in to kind of level the playing field or make them less attractive than low carbon goods produced in Europe. And it's not just Europe. The US, the Biden administration have said they want to reduce their emissions 52% by 2030, now against their 2005 baseline, so it's less ambitious, but still. And now I know the Biden administration may run into issues with the midterm elections in November, but still it talks to a direction of travel. And it's not just the EU and the US, but also China have said that they want to get to net zero by 2060, which is 10 years after Europe and the US, but at least, you know, they're talking it up, and they started their industrialization much later than us anyway. They've also said that they want to have their emissions peak in 2030, which is excellent. And they want to get 40% of their energy from renewables by 2030, which is really ambitious. However, Bloomberg reported a couple of weeks ago that they're on track to hit those goals by 2025. And China has a habit of doing that. They have a track record of putting up these really ambitious 5-year plans for renewables and then blowing through those targets early. Their targets for 2020, they blew through them in 2018. And then they put more ambitious targets, which they blew through in 2019. So this is going to happen. And some other kind of stakeholders who are in this space are the likes of the justice system. And what do I mean by that? Well, for example, court cases are now being taken against countries by their citizens. So in this case, France, but also it's happened in Germany and the Netherlands and a couple of other countries where the countries signed the Paris Climate Accord in 2015, and if the citizens think they're not doing enough to reach those goals, they take them to court. And in each of these cases, France, the Netherlands, and Germany, the citizens won against the government, and the governments have been mandated to do more. Companies, the fossil fuel companies, are being taken to court as well. We've seen cases taken against Exxon, against Chevron, against Shell, probably BP, although I'm not 100%. This is happening as well. And also, really interestingly, the police raided the offices of DWS and Deutsche Bank just a few weeks ago because they were selling goods which they said were low carbon, and they weren't. So they were perpetuating fraud in some of their ESG portfolios, or allegedly. Shareholders are becoming increasingly involved as well. We saw what was called Black Wednesday in May of last year. I think it was the 25th of May last year, where in the boardrooms, in the AGMs of several companies, it was Chevron and Exxon in the US. In the boardrooms of those companies, investors voted down the boards of directors. So they put 3 activist directors on the board of Exxon, and Chevron were forced by their shareholders to commit to greater climate targets. So more and more shareholders are becoming involved, and we're seeing investors also put pressure on the likes of the banks and the insurance companies with likes of Credit Suisse and JP Morgan. JP Morgan, interestingly, are the largest financier of fossil fuel projects and companies, and they're starting to feel the pressure from their shareholders as well. The development banks are now starting to say we're no longer going to fund fossil fuel projects. Both the US and the Chinese have said that they're not going to fund them anymore as well. Wall Street are getting involved, and this is interesting, I think. There's such a concept as the carbon budget and the carbon bomb. And what is that? Well, we have said in 2015 in Paris that we want to limit global warming to maximum 2 degrees C and preferably 1.5 degrees C. So right there, we've set our limits. And if we know where we are today, then we can calculate how much CO2 we can emit to get to that 1.5 and 2 degrees C. These are known numbers. To get from where we are today to 2 degrees C, it's around 1,000 gigatons of CO2. Now, again, without context, that's challenging. But if I tell you that the proven reserves of the fossil fuel companies and countries comes to 3,000 gigatons, you can see suddenly we have a big problem. because the proven reserves of these companies is what their share price is based on. It's what their market capitalization is based on. It's what their loans are guaranteed against. So these fossil fuel companies can either take that 3,000 gigatons out of the ground and stick it up in the sky and it's all over, or we stick to the 1,000 gigatons and they write off 2/3 of their value. If you have a pension or a share portfolio and any of your shares or your pension are invested in fossil fuel companies, you should be worried. Because if they're going to lose 2/3 of their value in the next few years, that's a major hit to your pension or your shareholdings. The Securities and Exchange Commission, in their most recent proposals, have said that they want all publicly traded companies in the US to report their climate risk. They're starting next year, 2023, with large companies, and 2024, all publicly listed companies, out to Scope 3, which is all emissions. This has never been mandated before. Not only that, they say those emissions reports have to be auditable. This means that the sustainability organizations, which in many companies today report into the chief marketing officer, that function will shift to the chief finance officer's organization. Because while that's the SEC in the US, that's also going to be mirrored with similar regulations in Europe very quickly. And because of that risk, we're now seeing the price of capitalization, the price of loans for fossil fuel companies is rising. If you look at, ironically, the green line, sorry about that, it's this Bloomberg data. The green line is offshore oil. If you are building an offshore oil platform today and you're trying to get it capitalized, it's going to cost you 20%. Similarly, LNG is about 11-12%. And if you look at the renewables on that chart there, they're all below 5% because there's zero risk. Insurance companies as well are starting to see this and are saying, nope, we're out. We're not going to cover these anymore. And similarly with the banks saying, nope, we're not going to. And we saw something called GFANZ. GFANZ arise in the Glasgow climate talks last year, in November of last year. GFANZ stands for the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And this is a coming together of 45 companies, finance companies, with a total of $130 trillion in assets. And while traditionally, a lot of that money might have gone to fund fossil fuel projects, they're now saying, nope, this money is now going exclusively to funding net zero projects. So the finance community is getting very much behind that. And then everybody else, the you and the me. One of the things I do in SAP is I run a podcast. Well, I run 2 podcasts. Well, 3 actually. Sorry. 3, but the third one is being shut down this week. So 2. One of them is on supply chain, but the other is on climate. I publish a new episode every Wednesday, so I dropped a new one at 6:30 5:30 Portuguese time this morning, 6:30 Spanish time. In the Climate 21 podcast, I interviewed a guy a few months back called Ken Pucker. Ken is the former COO of Timberland. And in that interview, one of the things he said was that when Timberland started out on their sustainability journey in the early 2000s, they had no problem recruiting people in. Anytime they advertised a job, he said the level of the people applying for the jobs there was astronomical, way higher than should have been the case for a company of their size. And it was all because they were telling this great sustainability story, which was backed up by great sustainability action. And not only did they find it easy to recruit top-class candidates, their retention levels were phenomenal as well. People wanted to stay working for a company that was doing the right thing. And so this is increasingly important. Also, of course, they found a massive increase in their sales because people want to be supporting companies that are doing the right thing. So if you have a good sustainability story to tell, backed up by good sustainability actions, your cost of recruitment and retention drop, and your cost of sales also drops, and your sales increase. We're starting to see as a result of this now that what Fareed referred to as the global economy is going to increasingly become the climate economy. No major business decisions moving forward will be taken without looking at not just their financial implications, but also their climate implications. Because to reach that 55% reduction by 2030, which is legally binding, we're going to see a lot of regulations coming down the line, impacting individuals, but increasingly impacting companies as well. And if we look at some of the things that are happening already today in the energy sector, for example, some of you might remember Sheikh Yamani, the OPEC oil minister from the 1980s, and he famously said that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones, and the oil age will similarly end long before we ran out of oil. And that's proving now to be very prescient, because it's happening today. And it's happening not because people care about the climate, unfortunately, but it's happening for reasons of economics, which actually is better, because it means it's more sustainable, it's more likely to stay happening because it's down to economics. The cost of renewables is falling year on year on year on year. Wind and solar are now a fraction of the price they were 10 years ago, and the cost keeps falling down to economies of scale and Wright's law, the experience curve. It is now cheaper today to build new greenfield renewables than it is to simply fuel existing fossil fuel plants. That is an incredible change. And that is going to continue to happen because the price of renewables is going to continue falling. And as we've seen, the cost of fossil fuel energy has gone up enormously in the last few months. Thank you, Vladimir. And if we look at storage options, lithium-ion batteries are now, the price of those has fallen 95% in the last 10 years. Not alone has the price fallen, but also the energy density has tripled. So now they're a fraction of the price they were, and they can store far more energy. And as a consequence of that, we're seeing that the global market for energy storage installations, and this is not batteries for cars, this is stationary storage for grids. You can see, and I hesitate to use the word explode when I'm talking about batteries, but the market for batteries is set to explode in the next few years. And as a result of all this, we're starting to see projects like the Sun Cable project in Australia, in the Northern Territories. This is phenomenal. The Sun Cable project is currently the largest renewable project in the world. They're building a 20 gigawatt, I think it's 22 gigawatt solar plant. Now, if you're unfamiliar with gigawatts, a 1 gigawatt is roughly the output of a nuclear power reactor. And they're building a plant which is the equivalent output of 22 nuclear reactors, and they're backing it up with 44 gigawatt hours of battery storage. They're going to use it to draw a cable across to the city of Darwin, but also they're drawing a cable 4,000 kilometers north to power Singapore. It is incredibly ambitious as projects go, and it's being funded in large part by, I've just forgotten his name. I'll think of it later. He's a tech billionaire, and it's nice to see tech billionaires doing something positive for a change. But if you think that's impressive, 22 gigawatts, well then Kazakhstan are going one better. They're building a 45 gigawatt renewable using not just solar, but solar and wind. And they're going to use it to manufacture or to produce green hydrogen, which they reckon there's going to be a big market for in the coming years, and they may well be right. So that's 45 gigawatts. And if you think that's big, and it is, well then China are building in the Gobi Desert a 450 gigawatt solar, wind, and battery power plant. It'll produce roughly 4% of the world's energy requirements when it's built out. And all these projects are possible because the cost of renewables is so cheap and getting cheaper with economies of scale. And of course, projects of this size will bring the costs down even further. You could never consider building a project of this size with fossil fuels or with nuclear. It would be impossible. But with renewables, because they scale, it's entirely possible. And I mentioned Vladimir. Well, thanks to him, the EU is now coughing up another 230 billion euros to ensure that we get off our dependence on Russian oil and gas. And we shouldn't just think of fossil fuels as bad for climate, which it is horrendous, but it's also really bad for our everyday health. The burning of fossil fuels today contributes directly to the early deaths of 8.7 million people per annum. 8.7 million people per annum die as a direct result of the burning of fossil fuels. That's more than COVID. We really, really got to get off fossil fuels as quickly as possible. Talk about the transportation sector and some of the things that are happening there. I mentioned I live in Spain. I moved there in 2008, and when I did, I needed to buy a car, family car. And because I'm this weirdo for whom sustainability is a big thing, my filter for buying a car in 2008 was emissions, and the car with the lowest emissions available in Spain at the time was a Prius, so I got that. Fine car, great, really reliable, drove it for 10 years, and then in 2018, I decided, okay, it's time to go fully electric. The Model 3 wasn't available in Europe at the time, so I went for a Nissan Leaf. And that was a bit of a compromise, I gotta say, because you can see here with the battery at 50%, the range is about 130 kilometers. Not fantastic. So last year, I switched up to a Volkswagen ID.4. Now I took that screenshot yesterday while I was on my way here on my phone. I logged into the car from my phone, and you can see that at 97% of battery, the car has a range of 500 kilometers. It's an amazing car, about 10 grand cheaper than any Tesla. And consequently, Volkswagen, and I'm not advertising for Volkswagen, there are other really good cars, Hyundai, Kia, all these other manufacturers are making really good EVs as well, but Volkswagen are sold out for the year. And so are probably Kia and Hyundai and all those other manufacturers. You go and try and get an electric car today, and you've got a waiting list. The amount of people who are saying they're going to buy EVs has doubled in the last 12 months. And that's based on data coming from February of this year before the invasion. So as gas prices have gone up, that's probably even gone higher. And you can see the sales figures for EVs are on an S-curve. We're kind of at the bottom of an S-curve. The limiting factor to the sale of EVs today is the availability of the cars. The manufacturers are constrained. They can't make enough to meet the demand. Norway is kind of the leader in this space. Fully today, about 95% of new vehicle sales in Norway are EVs. And that's down to some amazing, amazing incentives that they put in place for car buyers. And Europe has now said, as of last week, that from 2035, all new cars have to be zero emissions. So if you have a fossil fuel, if you're buying a fossil fuel car today or in 2030, what's its resale value going to be like? And with this 2035 deadline in place, how many car manufacturers are going to invest in internal combustion engine drivetrains when they won't be manufacturing any new ones before or after 2035? And it's not just personal transportation. I love this quote from Enrique Peñalosa, the former mayor of Bogota, where he says a developed country is not a place where poor people have cars, it's a place where rich people use public transportation. And because of that, things like the bus services need to switch to being fully electric. London now has the biggest electric bus fleet in Europe, but the biggest global electric bus fleet is in China. There are, I'm going to get the numbers wrong because my data is a few months old, but there are roughly 650,000 fully electric buses globally. About 600,000 of them are in China. China has perfected the technology and it's now starting to export it. Taxis are going electric as well. Addison Lee is the largest taxi company in the UK. And it makes enormous sense for a taxi to be fully electric because the costs of fueling them are a fraction of the costs of petrol or diesel. The maintenance costs are less than 50% because they have very few moving parts. So taxis are going to switch very quickly. Last mile delivery. Amazon has ordered 100,000 fully electric Rivians. DB Schenker, one of the largest delivery companies, is going electric as well. They've ordered 1,500 Voltas. And it's not just the last mile delivery, it's the larger trucks as well, the Class 8 ones. Volkswagen are starting to manufacture those, and not just Volkswagen, Volvo and Kenworth, all these ones, or Volvo, they're all starting to see that this is where they need to go, electrification of transportation. And of course, once that electrification, once those electric trucks are fueled by renewable energy, you get a massive win-win. Maersk, the shipping company, are looking at shifting all their container ships to using green methanol. And of course, ferries. Ferries are a fantastic use case. I was in Norway a couple of years ago, and about half of the ferries I was on in Norway were electric or hybrid, which is amazing. And this is Washington State Ferries. It's the second largest ferry company in the world, and they say they're shifting completely to ferries. Food production is another area where we're starting to see a lot of changes. This is what traditional food production looks like. Looks absolutely gorgeous. It's horrifically wasteful. Look at all that water that's being wasted because 95% of that water is going to evaporate before it ever gets to the roots. And the land use, horrific. What we need to do, and it's starting to happen, is shift to massive indoor vertical farms. There's a company called Andever. I interviewed the CEO of Andever on my Climate 21 podcast last year. They have a massive indoor vertical farm in Kuwait, in the desert, supplying Kuwait City. They're producing 500 kilos of fresh greens per day. And of course, when it's produced in a big indoor vertical farm, you can completely control the atmosphere, the light. You can tell plants when to germinate, when to flower, when to produce fruits. That's all controlled by heat and light and CO2 levels. You don't need pesticides. You don't need fertilizers. You don't need herbicides, weed killers. You're using 5% of the land and 5% of the water in regular production, so it's really, really, really sustainable. And that indoor vertical farm they have in Kuwait, they're building another one now in Singapore, which is going to produce 1,500 kilos of fresh greens per day. And then you see things like Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat, who are producing meat directly from plants with no animals harmed, which is what animals do. Animals eat plants and turn it into protein, which we eat. What the likes of Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods are doing is they're taking out the middleman, the animal, taking the plant, turning that into protein that we eat. And it's really good. I've eaten Beyond Meat's burgers, and they're phenomenal. Fish is starting to be produced this way. Fish meat, artificial fish meat is starting to be produced from plants as well. Again, on the podcast, sorry to be plugging the podcast so much, but again, on my Climate 21 podcast, I had a German company called Betta Fish on 2-3 weeks ago, and they're producing tuna from algae. So there's no fishing of tuna required, and they're selling it, and it's doing really well. Then you have lab-produced chicken. And lab-produced chicken is done, and it's not just chicken, they're doing beef this way as well. They take a biopsy from a live animal. Better than killing the animal, they just take a biopsy about the size of a pea, put that into culture, and grow the meat in a lab, and use that to produce burgers, patties, mince, all that kind of stuff, with minimally invasive harm to the animal. And some companies, as a Spanish company, are starting to produce meat using 3D printers to try and get the texture as close as possible to steak. So there's a lot of things happening in the food space, and it's really, really important we do this, because we need to give back to nature the land that we have stolen from it for agriculture today, for food production today, return it to nature, return it for things like ecotourism, return it for biodiversity, for carbon sequestration services. All of this is hugely important and needs to happen. Other sectors, the concrete sector is one that is responsible for enormous amounts of emissions. But now we're starting to see companies do things like produce concrete where CO2 is actually an ingredient, it's an input rather than an output. Cambridge University have published this study showing how they can produce concrete which is net zero, zero emission concrete. And that's going to be really important as we move forward. Steel production is another one where we have to get the emissions out because it's massively contaminating. And that's starting to happen too. ArcelorMittal in Germany are converting 2 of their plants to producing fossil fuel-free steel. And Volvo, the car company, has committed to producing all of its cars from 2026, I think it is, 2025 or 2026, onwards using fossil fuel-free steel. That's really hard to say, fossil fuel-free, anyway. And they've taken delivery of their first fossil fuel-free steel last August or September it was, from SSAB. Aviation is another sector, and we're starting to see some really interesting things happen in that space. United Airlines last year took ordered 100 19-seater, fully electric 19-seater planes. We're not going to see transatlantic flights fully electric anytime soon, but this is a move in the right direction for commuter planes at least. And Airbus have shown this blended wing craft, which they say will be zero emissions that they're going to start production of, they say, between 2035 and 2050. If you're thinking, what should I be doing, or what should the organization I'm in be doing? Well, I have some suggestions. Set targets, measure, and report against them. That's the very first thing. Now, to do this, to do your measurements, it's really important that you digitize as much of your processes as possible. And I would be very remiss at this point if I didn't put up a little ad for the company I work for, SAP. We have a lot of solutions for this kind of thing, and we have a booth outside on the show floor. Coming back, convert everything in your organization to electric. Heating, lighting is obviously probably electric already, but heating, cooling, cooking if you're doing it, transportation, everything possible. Get it off fossil fuels, no gas, no diesel, no petrol, none of that, all electric, and then switch to a 100% renewable energy provider. Really low-hanging fruit stuff, massively effective. Become more circular in everything you do. Require emissions reporting in all the RFPs and RFQs you put out. Require your suppliers, and this is going to be hard. It's going to be hard for your suppliers, so you're going to need to work with them to bring them up to speed on this very often. And set an internal carbon price. Microsoft did this, incredibly effective. You set an internal carbon price for any project that your organization is doing, and the money you collect from that internal carbon price, you give it to the sustainability organization in your company so that they can then use it to do things like rolling out car chargers in your car park, or buying renewable energy, or things like that. And finally, and probably the most effective one, make sure your executive remuneration is tied to emissions reduction KPIs. If you all did that, we come back here next year, we'd have a very different result. So, last thoughts. We have said that the 2020s are going to be the decade of action, and they are, because that 55% I mentioned, we've got to get it out. However, that 55% is the low-hanging fruit, which means the 2030s are going to be the decade of way more action. And the 2040s are going to be the decade of, holy crap, that's a lot of action. I came across this really interesting quote and really thought-provoking quote from a climate scientist called Professor Kevin Anderson. And he said, "We face an unavoidably radical future. We either reap the radical repercussions of severe climate change, or else we pursue radical emissions reductions. Either way, there is no non-radical future." Now, I mentioned my dad at the start, and I think he would be saddened to see where we are today. But I think also, given the opportunities we have and the things we have started to do, the journey that we are on, I think that would make him happy, because I think we all need to step up and become climate heroes. Thank you very much. Obrigado.